Rome. The year is AD 64. The most powerful city in the world is in flames. 7 days of fire. 10 of the 14 districts destroyed. Thousands of charred bodies in the streets. And an emperor who, according to the Romans themselves, played the lyre while everything burned. Nero needed a scapegoat, and he found one. An obscure group, followers of a Jew executed 30 years earlier in Judea, people whom the populace called Christians, or something like that. What Nero did not know is that by persecuting them, by burning them alive as torches in his gardens, by covering them with animal skins to be torn apart by dogs, he was creating the greatest proof that this man, this Christus, truly existed. And who recorded all of this? A Roman senator, a historian who despised Christians, a man who called their faith a pernicious superstition and described them as hated for their abominations. His name was Publius Cornelius Tacitus, and unintentionally, without intent, without ever imagining it, he wrote one of the greatest extra-biblical evidences for the historical existence of Jesus. This is the story of how an enemy became a witness. To understand the weight of what Tacitus wrote, we must first understand who he was, and more importantly, who he was not. Tacitus was not a Christian. He was not a Jew. He was not sympathetic to either religion. He was Rome. Born around AD 56, Publius Cornelius Tacitus belonged to the equestrian class, the Roman aristocracy just below the senatorial order. His father was likely a provincial procurator. Tacitus himself climbed every rung of power: lawyer, quaestor, praetor, consul, governor of Asia, senator. Tacitus did not write to please. He wrote to record. And he recorded with a style so precise, so caustic, so relentless, that modern historians regard him as the greatest chronicler of ancient Rome. But there was more. As a provincial governor, Tacitus most likely presided over trials of Christians. He interrogated them. He sentenced them. His close friend, Pliny the Younger, did exactly this in Bithynia, and exchanged letters with Emperor Trajan asking how to deal with these followers of Christus. In other words, Tacitus knew Christians firsthand. He knew who they were. He knew what they believed. And he despised them deeply. Now imagine the setting. It is the early 2nd century. Tacitus, now elderly, decides to write his magnum opus, the Annals, a monumental history of the Roman Empire, covering events from the death of Augustus in AD 14 to the fall of Nero in AD 68. 16 books, decades of history, emperors, wars, intrigues, assassinations, and at some point, in Book 15, while describing the Great Fire of Rome under Nero, Tacitus must explain who those people were, whom the emperor used as scapegoats. Who were the Christians? Where did they come from? And who was this Christus who gave the group its name? Tacitus could have ignored it. He could have simply said, an Eastern sect. But no, he was too meticulous, too precise. And so, in just a few lines, perhaps not even 50 words in Latin, he wrote something that would echo for 2,000 years, something he never imagined would become one of the greatest Roman evidences for the existence of Jesus. But before we reach those words, we must go even further back in time. We must understand the world into which Tacitus was born, the empire in which he was raised, and the superstition he so deeply despised, because nothing that happened was an accident. Judea, 1st century. A narrow strip of land squeezed between the Mediterranean Sea and the Jordan River. Arid mountains, fertile valleys, and a city burning at the heart of 3 continents, Jerusalem. For Rome, Judea was a problem, not because of its size, it was tiny compared to the vast provinces of Gaul or Hispania. Not because of its wealth, there were far richer regions in the east. The problem was something else. The Jews were different. Throughout the Roman Empire, conquered peoples absorbed Rome's gods. They accepted the imperial cult. They burned incense before statues of the Caesars. That was how it worked. You could keep your local gods as long as you added the Roman ones to the pantheon, but the Jews refused. One God, invisible, without image, without statue, and no other besides him. This intransigence deeply irritated Roman administrators. Pliny the Elder called the Jews a race remarkable for their contempt of the gods. Tacitus, decades later, would describe their customs as sinister and shameful. The Sabbath, circumcision, dietary laws, all of it seemed bizarre to Roman eyes. But Rome was pragmatic. As long as taxes were paid and order maintained, the Jews could worship their strange god. Augustus even granted special exemptions. Tiberius oscillated between tolerance and expulsions. Peace was fragile, but it existed. It was in this cauldron, political, religious, economic, that the man whom Tacitus would call Christus was born. The Judea of the early 1st century was not merely a Roman province. It was a powder keg. King Herod the Great had died in 4 BC, leaving behind monumental palaces. The Temple of Jerusalem rebuilt in unparalleled splendor, and a kingdom divided among incompetent sons. Rome intervened. In AD 6, Judea was annexed directly as a Roman province. A prefect would be sent from Rome to govern. Roman soldiers would march through the streets of Jerusalem. Tax collectors, many of them Jewish collaborators, would extract tribute for the empire. Resentment simmered. Messianic movements sprang up like weeds. Prophets emerged in the desert promising deliverance. Zealots preached armed resistance. Sicarii assassinated collaborators in broad daylight, hiding daggers beneath their garments. And then, sometime between 4 BC and AD 6, historians debate the exact date. A boy was born in Galilee. Some say in Bethlehem, others in Nazareth. His Hebrew name was Yeshua. In Greek, Jesus. In Latin, Jesus, Jesus.
What do we know about him outside Christian texts?
This is the question that has haunted historians for centuries. And this is precisely where sources like Tacitus become crucial. The Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, are documents of faith, written by followers for followers. That does not mean they are fiction, but it does mean they have a theological purpose, not merely a historical one. For the secular historian, the question is there any evidence outside these texts? The answer is yes, and not a little. Flavius Josephus, a Jewish historian writing for Roman patrons around AD 93 to 94, mentions Jesus twice in his Jewish Antiquities. One of these passages, the so-called Testimonium Flavianum, is controversial, likely altered by later Christian copyists, but the other, which mentions James, the brother of Jesus, who is called Christ, is accepted as authentic by the vast majority of scholars. Suetonius, another Roman historian, mentions in his Life of Claudius that the emperor expelled Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting at the instigation of Christus. The date? Around AD 49, less than 20 years after the crucifixion. Pliny the Younger, writing to Emperor Trajan around AD 112, describes Christians who sang hymns to Christus as to a god. And Tacitus, who had no reason to invent, no interest in promoting, no incentive to even mention this Christus, except that he was far too meticulous a historian to ignore him. But let us return to the origins. Jesus grew up in Galilee, a region north of Judea, known for its rural population, its fishermen, its peasants, a land of simple people, regarded with a measure of disdain by the sophisticated inhabitants of Jerusalem. Around the age of 30, again dates are approximate, he began to preach. What exactly did he preach? The Gospels record parables, ethical teachings, proclamations about a coming kingdom of God. But to the Romans, None of this mattered. What mattered was something else. His followers called him Messiah. In Hebrew, Mashiach. In Greek, Christos. In Latin, Christus, the Anointed One, the promised king who would restore Israel. For a first-century Jew, Messiah was a political title as much as a religious one. The Hebrew prophets had promised a descendant of David who would liberate Israel from its oppressors, and in the first century, the oppressors were Rome. This was dangerous. Sometime between AD 30 and 33, the exact date is debated, Jesus entered Jerusalem during Passover, the festival celebrating Israel's liberation from Egypt. The city was packed with pilgrims, tension was palpable. Roman soldiers watched from the heights of the Antonia fortress beside the temple. And then, something happened. The Gospels describe a triumphal entry, crowds shouting, "Hosanna!" An incident in the temple where Jesus allegedly overturned the tables of the money changers. Whatever the precise sequence of events, the result was clear. Jesus drew the attention of the authorities. Of the Jewish authorities, the high priest Caiaphas and the Sanhedrin, who saw him as a threat to the fragile peace with Rome. And of the Roman authorities, embodied in Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea since AD 26. Pilate, the man Tacitus would mention 80 years later in his Annals. The man whose name would be repeated in Christian creeds for 2 millennia, suffered under Pontius Pilate. What do we know about Pilate? More than one might expect. Josephus describes him as brutal and insensitive to Jewish customs. Philo of Alexandria calls him inflexible, stubborn, and cruel. He provoked riots by bringing Roman standards bearing the emperor's image into Jerusalem, a sacrilege in Jewish eyes. He massacred Galileans in the midst of sacrifice. He appropriated temple funds to build an aqueduct. And in 1961, an archaeological discovery confirmed his historicity definitively. The Pilate Stone. Found in Caesarea Maritima, the Roman administrative capital of Judea, this Latin inscription mentions Pontius Pilate, prefect of Judea. It is the only direct archaeological evidence of his existence, and it corroborates the accounts of Tacitus, Josephus, and the Gospels.
But there is an intriguing detail. The inscription calls Pilate a prefect, prefectus. Tacitus, however, calls him a procurator, procurator. Some skeptics have used this discrepancy to question Tacitus's passage, but the explanation is simpler. Tacitus used the title common in his own era, decades later. Procurators and prefects had similar functions, and the terms were often used interchangeably. The point remains. Pilate was real. Judea was real. And the execution of a man named Jesus, under his authority, during the reign of Tiberius, all of this fits perfectly within the historical record. Crucifixion was a Roman method of execution, not Jewish. Roman. Jews stoned, Romans crucified. It was reserved for the worst criminals, rebellious slaves, pirates, political insurgents. It was public, slow, humiliating. The condemned was stripped naked, nailed or tied to a wooden cross, and left to die over hours, or even days. The message was clear. This is what happens to those who defy Rome. That Jesus was crucified and not stoned indicates that his execution was carried out by Roman authorities, not Jewish ones. The charge? Most likely crimen laesae majestatis, treason against the majesty of the state. In other words, claiming to be king of the Jews was a threat to the emperor. The Gospels record that Pilate ordered a placard to be placed on the cross. Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In Latin, Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judaeorum. INRI. Irony? Mockery? Perhaps. But also documentation. Pilate was making it clear. This man was executed for sedition. And then Jesus died.
For Rome, it was the end of yet another Galilean agitator. One among dozens, perhaps hundreds. Nothing special, nothing memorable. But something happened afterward.
something that transformed a group of terrified fishermen into preachers who defied the empire, something that caused this movement, this pernicious superstition, in Tacitus's words, to burst out of Judea and spread all the way to Rome itself. What was this something? Christians would say, the resurrection. Skeptics would offer other explanations: collective hallucination, body theft, gradual myth-making. But the historian must stop here. What happened after the death of Jesus lies beyond the reach of conventional historical investigation. What can be documented is the effect, and the effect was staggering. In less than 3 decades, there were Christians in Rome. In less than 3 centuries, Christianity would become the official religion of the very empire that crucified its founder. But before that triumph, there would be fire, there would be blood, there would be Nero, and there would be Tacitus, observing it all with the cold eyes of a historian, never imagining that his words would cross millennia.
Jerusalem, AD 33, perhaps 30. Historians still debate the date. A small group of Galileans is gathered in a room on the outskirts of the city, mostly fishermen, ordinary people, no formal education, no political connections, no resources. Their leader had been executed weeks earlier as a criminal, crucified, humiliated, abandoned. By every historical logic, this should have been the end. Messianic movements arose and vanished in Judea with depressing regularity. Judas the Galilean led a revolt in AD 6. It was crushed, his followers scattered. Theudas proclaimed himself a prophet decades later, beheaded, movement extinguished. The pattern was always the same. Leader dead, followers fled, end of the story. But with the followers of Jesus, something different happened. They did not flee. They did not disperse. They did not quietly return to their fishing nets in Galilee. Instead, they began to preach. And what they preached was scandalous. Christus has risen. That was the core message, not a metaphor, not a symbol, a literal, bodily, physical resurrection. The man who had been nailed to a Roman cross, who had died of asphyxiation under the Judean sun, who had been hastily buried before the Sabbath, that man was alive. For a first-century Jew, the idea was not entirely absurd. Pharisees believed in a resurrection at the end of time. But resurrection now? Of one person? Before the final judgment? That was unprecedented. For a Greek or a Roman, it was simply ridiculous. Greeks believed in the immortality of the soul, not of the body. The body was a prison, not a temple. The idea that a corpse could return to life, and that this would be desirable, sounded barbaric, primitive, repulsive. Paul of Tarsus, who would become the greatest missionary of early Christianity, would admit this decades later. We preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. Scandal, foolishness. And yet, the movement grew. How? Why? Historians have debated these questions for centuries. The answers vary depending on whom you ask. Christian theologians point to divine action, the Holy Spirit, the truth of the resurrection confirmed by eyewitnesses willing to die for it. Secular sociologists highlight more earthly factors, the network of Jewish synagogues spread throughout the empire, which provided initial infrastructure, the Pax Romana, which allowed relatively safe travel across the Mediterranean, the spiritual vacuum of a society in which traditional gods were losing credibility, the message of equality that attracted slaves, women, and the marginalized. Both perspectives capture part of the truth. What is undeniable is the result. In less than 2 decades, what began as a Jewish sect in Galilee had communities in Antioch, Ephesus, Corinth, Philippi, Thessalonica, and Rome. The Christian community in Rome is a historical mystery. We do not know exactly when it began. We do not know who founded it. Catholic tradition attributes its foundation to Peter, the Galilean fisherman, whom Jesus allegedly designated as leader.
but the evidence is fragmentary. What we do know is that by around AD 49, there were already enough Christians in Rome to cause trouble. Suetonius, the Roman historian, records in his Life of Claudius that the emperor expelled the Jews from Rome because they were constantly rioting at the instigation of Christus. The spelling Christus instead of Christus was common. The sounds were nearly identical in Latin. And rioting suggests conflict within the Roman Jewish community between those who accepted Jesus as Messiah and those who rejected him. This expulsion is corroborated by the New Testament. The book of Acts mentions a Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla, who left Rome because Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart. They became collaborators of Paul. In other words, less than 20 years after the crucifixion, the name Christus was already known in Rome, already causing divisions, already troubling imperial authority. And then a man entered the scene who would change everything. Not Peter, not Paul. Nero.
Nero Claudius Caesar Augustus Germanicus was born in AD 37, the great-nephew of Emperor Tiberius. His mother, Agrippina the Younger, was one of the most ambitious and ruthless women in Roman history. She manipulated, seduced, poisoned, and conspired to place her son on the throne. And she succeeded. In AD 54, Emperor Claudius died, probably poisoned by Agrippina with mushrooms. Nero, at 16, became ruler of the world. The early years were promising. Nero had capable advisors, the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus. There were administrative reforms, tax relief, public spectacles. The young emperor seemed interested in poetry, music, theatre. Eccentricities, perhaps, but harmless ones. But there was something darker beneath the surface. In AD 59, Nero ordered the murder of his own mother. Agrippina, who had placed him in power, had become too inconvenient, too controlling. First, they tried to drown her on a boat designed to sink. When she survived by swimming to shore, Nero sent soldiers to finish the job. Seneca, his tutor, drafted the official justification. Agrippina had conspired against the emperor. A lie, of course. But Rome accepted it. Rome always accepted it. With his mother dead and his advisors gradually sidelined, Nero plunged into his passions. He wanted to be an artist. Not metaphorically, literally. Nero sang, played the lyre, acted on public stages. For the Roman aristocracy, this was an unbearable scandal. Emperors could patronize artists, not be artists. Public performance was the domain of slaves, freedmen, the lower classes. But Nero did not care. He built a massive wooden amphitheater for performances, forced senators to attend his shows for hours, competed in Greek games, and unsurprisingly, always won. Adulation was mandatory. Ridicule, whispered in private, was universal. And while Nero sang, Rome decayed. The economy suffered. The provinces murmured. The elite conspired. The people, entertained by ever more extravagant spectacles, remained distracted. For now. There were also religious tensions. The Roman Empire was, paradoxically, both tolerant and intolerant in matters of religion. Tolerant because it accommodated thousands of local cults. Each conquered people could keep its gods, as long as it also honored the gods of Rome and, crucially, the genius of the emperor. Intolerant because that honor was mandatory. Refusing the imperial cult was not merely heresy, it was treason. It was declaring that Caesar was not divine. It was questioning the cosmic order that upheld the empire. The Jews had a special exemption, negotiated since the days of Julius Caesar. They could worship their one god without offering sacrifices to the emperor. In return, they offered sacrifices for the emperor in their temple in Jerusalem, a pragmatic compromise that worked most of the time. But the Christians? Christians were a new problem. At first, Rome saw them as a subdivision of Judaism, another sect, like the Pharisees, Sadducees, Essenes. But gradually, the differences became clear.
Christians admitted Gentiles without circumcision. Christians distanced themselves from synagogues. Christians refused any sacrifice that was not offered to their own God, neither to the emperor nor for the emperor. And perhaps most disturbing, Christians preached that their executed leader was the true Lord of the universe, not Caesar, Christus. By around AD 60, the Christian community in Rome had reconstituted itself after the expulsion under Claudius. Estimates vary, but some historians suggest there may have been several thousand Christians in the city, a tiny fraction of a population of 1 million, but significant enough to be noticed. They met in private homes. They had no temples. They had no official priests in the Roman sense. They shared ritual meals, bread and wine that, they claimed, were the body and blood of their Lord. That last detail generated macabre rumors. Body and blood? Cannibalism, Roman neighbors whispered. And those nocturnal meetings, where they called one another brothers and sisters and exchanged the kiss of peace, incest, obviously. Add to this their refusal to participate in public festivals involving sacrifices to the gods. Christians did not go to temples. They did not eat sacrificial meat. They did not join civic celebrations. To the average Roman, this was odium humani generis, hatred of the human race, misanthropy. These Christians despised the gods who protected Rome, despised ancestral traditions, despised civilization itself. If something went wrong, a plague, a drought, a military defeat, who would be blamed? Those who had offended the gods, of course. And then came the fire. July 18th, AD 64. The night was hot. The Roman summer was at its peak. In warehouses near the Circus Maximus, where flammable goods were sold, oils, fabrics, wood, a spark found fuel. No one knows how it began. Accident? Arson? Negligence? What we know is what followed. The fire spread with terrifying speed. Rome was a city of densely packed buildings, narrow streets, wooden apartment blocks called insulae. Flames leapt from roof to roof. The wind fed the destruction. For 6 days and 7 nights, Rome burned. Of the city's 14 districts, 3 were completely destroyed. 7 others suffered severe damage. Centuries-old temples, monuments of the Republic, public archives, all turned to ash. Thousands died. Tens of thousands were left homeless. And Nero? Tradition says he played the lyre while the city burned, singing verses about the destruction of Troy. This is probably exaggerated. Nero was in Antium when the fire began and, according to Tacitus, rushed back to coordinate relief efforts. But the legends stuck. And in Rome, legends were as dangerous as facts. When the flames finally died out, Rome was a field of smoldering ruins. And the survivors, traumatized, hungry, furious, wanted answers. Who did this? Eyes turned toward the palace. Rumors began to circulate. Nero had ordered the fire to rebuild Rome according to his own grand designs. Nero wanted space for his new palace, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. Nero hated the old city with its crooked streets and wanted to create a new capital in his own image. Did these rumors have any foundation? Impossible to know with certainty. Tacitus, writing 50 years later, is cautious. He presents the rumors without fully endorsing them, but also without dismissing them. The truth, the historian admits, remains obscure. What Tacitus states clearly is what came next. Nero needed scapegoats, and he found them. Therefore, to suppress the rumor, Nero falsely charged with guilt and punished with the most exquisite tortures those whom the people called Christians, hated for their abominations. This sentence opens Tacitus's most important passage on Christians, the passage that mentions Christus, the passage that would become one of the greatest extra-biblical evidences for the historical existence of Jesus. But let us not reach the exact words just yet, because before we analyze what Tacitus wrote, we must understand what Nero did. And what he did was create the first Christian martyrs of Rome.
Nero's Gardens. Today, the site is occupied by St. Peter's Basilica in Vatican City, but in AD 64, it was a vast imperial leisure complex on the Vatican Hill across the Tiber River. Ornamental gardens, elegant pavilions, a private circus where the emperor practiced chariot racing. It was there that Nero decided to stage his spectacle. Not just any spectacle, a spectacle of death. Tacitus describes the scene with icy precision. To their deaths were added mockeries. Covered with the skins of beasts, they were torn to pieces by dogs and perished. Or they were nailed to crosses, or they were doomed to the flames, and when daylight failed, they were burned to serve as nightly illumination. Read that again. Christians covered in the skins of wild animals, thrown into improvised arenas to be ripped apart by hunting dogs. Christians nailed to crosses, the very method used to execute their Messiah 30 years earlier. Christians soaked in pitch, tied to posts, and set alight as living torches to illuminate the emperor's nighttime festivities. Later Christian tradition would call those posts Lampades Neronianae, Nero's torches. The painter Henryk Siemieradzki immortalized the scene in his 1876 canvas, showing elegantly dressed Romans strolling through the gardens while human bodies burn in the background, lighting the night. It was entertainment. How many died? No one knows with precision. Tacitus speaks of a multitudo ingens, an immense multitude. Some modern historians estimate hundreds, others thousands. The Christian community in Rome was nearly annihilated, but something unexpected happened. Tacitus, who despised Christians, who called them adherents of a pernicious superstition, who agreed that they were hated for their abominations, this same Tacitus records a shift in public mood. Hence there arose a feeling of compassion, because it was perceived that they were being destroyed not for the public good, but to satisfy the cruelty of one man. Nero's excess provoked disgust. The sadism was too much even for Roman stomachs, accustomed to gladiators and public executions. Were the Christians guilty? Perhaps. Did they deserve to die? Probably, many Romans thought. But like that? Nero's brutality turned criminals into victims, and victims, over time, can become martyrs. But let us leave theology to the theologians. What matters here is the document, the evidence, the words Tacitus put to parchment around AD 116, 50 years after the events. Because in the middle of his description of the persecution, Tacitus paused, a historian's pause. He needed to explain to his Roman readers who these people were, where they came from, why they were called Christians. And then he wrote, Auctor nominis eius Christus, Tiberio imperitante, per Procuratorum Pontium Pilatum, supplicio adfectus erat. In translation, the author of that name, Christus, had been executed during the reign of Tiberius by the Procurator Pontius Pilate. 22 words in Latin. 22 words that became one of the most debated pieces of evidence in ancient history. Let us analyze them one by one.
Auctor nominis eius, the author of that name. Tacitus is explaining the origin of the term Christians. They are called that because of a founder named Christus, not an invented title, not an abstraction, a real person who gave rise to the movement. Christus, the Latin form of the Greek Christos, which translates the Hebrew Mashiach, Messiah, the Anointed One. Notice Tacitus does not write Jesus. He uses the title by which the man was known among his followers. That is significant. A Christian forger would likely have written Jesus Christ or Our Lord Jesus. Tacitus uses only the title, as an outsider would. Tiberio imperitante, during the reign of Tiberius. Tiberius ruled from AD 14 to 37. Jesus' crucifixion, according to the Gospels, occurred during his reign, probably between AD 30 and 33. The chronology fits. Per Procuratorem Pontium Pilatum, by the Procurator Pontius Pilate. Here is the detail that anchors the historicity. Pilate is documented by multiple sources. Josephus, Philo, the Pilate Stone.
He was prefect of Judea from AD 26 to 36. Again, the chronology is consistent. We have already addressed the Procurator versus prefect issue. It is not an error. It is either a deliberate anachronism or simply the use of the term more familiar to Tacitus's readers. Supplicio adfectus erat, had been executed, or had suffered capital punishment. Supplicium in Latin can mean punishment, torture, or execution. In context, it clearly refers to death. And what kind of death? Tacitus does not specify, but his Roman readers would know. In Judea, for an accused insurgent, the standard method was crucifixion. What this passage does not say is just as revealing. It does not mention miracles. It does not mention resurrection. It does not mention divine teaching. There is nothing suggesting admiration or reverence. On the contrary. Immediately after this sentence, Tacitus continues, "And the pernicious superstition, repressed for the moment, broke out again, not only through Judea, the source of that evil, but even through the city." Pernicious superstition, source of that evil. These are not the words of a sympathizer, not the words of a Christian inserting propaganda into a Roman text. These are the words of a Roman aristocrat who regarded Christianity as an Eastern disease infecting the capital of the world. And that is precisely why the passage is so valuable. But here we enter controversial territory, because the only manuscript that preserves this passage, the so-called Second Medicean, or M2, hides a disturbing secret.
The Second Medicean is a codex copied around AD 1030 to 1050 at the Benedictine monastery of Monte Cassino in Italy. It is the only surviving manuscript containing books 11 to 16 of Tacitus's Annals. Without it, we would not have the passage about Christians. It is now held in the Biblioteca Medicia Laurentiana in Florence. In 1902, the German scholar Georg Andresen examined the manuscript and noticed something odd in the word Christianos. The first letter I looked different. There was an unusual spacing after it. Its form did not exactly match the scribe's other letters. Andresen proposed a hypothesis. Originally, the word was not Christianos. It was Christianos. At some point, someone had scraped away the E and replaced it with an I. In 1950, the hypothesis was tested. At the request of historian Harold Fuchs, the director of the Laurentiana Library, Dr. Teresa Lodi, examined the manuscript under ultraviolet light. The result was unequivocal. There were, indeed, traces of an original E beneath the current I. The alteration was visible. Someone had modified the text. What does that mean? It depends on whom you ask. For some skeptics, such as historian Richard Carrier, this is evidence of Christian tampering. The original text of Tacitus, they argue, spoke of Christians, possibly a group different from Christians. The sentence about Christus and Pilate may have been interpolated later to create proof of Jesus' existence. For most scholars, however, the explanation is more mundane. Christianos and Christianos were interchangeable spellings in the ancient world. The sounds were nearly identical. Tacitus himself may have written Christianos, reflecting common pronunciation, and a later scribe corrected it to the spelling more familiar in his own era. Tertullian, a 2nd century Christian writer, notes that pagans often pronounced Christianus instead of Christianus. The Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest New Testament manuscripts, uses Christianoi in all 3 places where the term appears. In other words, the manuscript alteration may not be falsification. It may simply be orthographic standardization, a medieval scribe regularizing spelling for readers. But there is a deeper question. If the sentence about Christus and Pilate were a Christian interpolation, why would it be so neutral? Think about it. A Christian forger inserting text into a pagan document to prove Jesus existed, would he write only this? Only that he was executed by Pilate under Tiberius? Would he not mention miracles, the resurrection, divine sonship? Compare it to the Testimonium Flavianum, the passage about Jesus in Josephus that we know was Christianly doctored. That passage says Jesus was the Christ, that he appeared alive on the third day, that the divine prophets foretold these and 10,000 other wonderful things about him. That is what a Christian interpolation looks like. Tacitus's passage does not look like that. It looks exactly like what a hostile Roman historian would write, the bare minimum needed to explain who the Christians were, with no sympathy, no reverence, no propaganda.
There is yet another argument for authenticity. No church father cites this passage in the first centuries of Christianity. At first glance, that seems strange. If the passage existed, why did Christian apologists not use it to prove Jesus' existence to pagan critics? The answer is simple. The passage was too embarrassing. Tacitus calls Christianity a pernicious superstition. He says Christians were hated for their abominations. He describes their faith as an evil originating in Judea. What apologist would quote that? Look, a Roman historian confirms our Savior existed, and also that we were a contemptible sect hated by all humanity. It makes no sense. The silence of the Church Fathers is not evidence that the passage did not exist. It is evidence that it was too inconvenient to cite. The conclusion of most historians, Christian, agnostic, and atheist, is that Tacitus's passage is authentic. Bart Ehrman, an agnostic New Testament scholar and frequent critic of Christian tradition, is categorical. Tacitus's report confirms what we know from other sources, that Jesus was executed by order of the Roman governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. James Rives, a specialist in Roman religion at the University of North Carolina, states, "I have never encountered any dispute over the authenticity of Annals 15.44. As far as I know, it has always been accepted as genuine." John P. Meyer, a Catholic priest and historian of the historical Jesus, writes, "Despite some feeble attempts to show that this text is a Christian interpolation, the passage is obviously genuine. The consensus is not unanimous. Consensuses rarely are. But it is overwhelming. And so, a man who despised Christians, who saw them as adherents of an execrable superstition, who recorded their torture and death with a chronicler's coldness, that man became, involuntarily, one of the greatest witnesses to the historical existence of Jesus." Tacitus did not want to prove anything. He had no theological agenda. He was neither defending nor attacking Christian faith. He was simply doing his job, recording the history of Rome. And in doing so, he recorded something else. He recorded that around AD 30, in Judea, under the authority of Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Emperor Tiberius, a man called Christus was executed, and that his followers, far from disappearing, multiplied until they reached Rome itself. A pernicious superstition, in Tacitus's words. A faith that would change the world, in the words of history. Nero did not last long. 4 years after the Great Fire of Rome, 4 years after turning Christians into living torches in his gardens, the artist emperor faced his own destruction. AD 68. The empire was collapsing. Revolts erupted in the provinces. Gaul rose under Julius Vindex. Hispania proclaimed Galba emperor. The Rhine armies wavered. The Senate, humiliated by Nero for years, finally found its courage. In June of AD 68, the Senate declared Nero a public enemy. The man who had ruled the world for 14 years fled Rome in disguise, hiding in a villa on the outskirts of the city. When soldiers came to arrest him, Nero did not have the courage to kill himself alone. He needed the help of a freedman to drive the dagger into his own throat. His last words, according to Suetonius, "Qualis artifex pereo," what an artist dies with me. Even at the end, it was about him. What followed was chaos. AD 69 became known as the Year of the Four Emperors. Galba, Otho, Vitellius, each rose to the throne only to be overthrown within months. Civil wars tore the empire apart.
Legions marched against legions. Rome bled. In the end, Vespasian emerged, a general of modest origins who had been busy crushing a revolt in Judea. He founded the Flavian dynasty, brought stability, rebuilt what Nero had destroyed, including Rome. The Domus Aurea, Nero's golden palace built atop the ashes of the fire, was partially demolished. In its place, Vespasian raised an amphitheater for the people, the Colosseum. And the Christians? Nero's persecution was brutal, but localized. It was concentrated in Rome. It lasted months, not years. And after the emperor's death, there was no systematic policy of extermination. Christianity survived. More than that, it grew. Christian tradition preserved the names of two prominent martyrs from that period, Peter and Paul. According to that tradition, both were executed in Rome during Nero's persecution. Peter, crucified upside down in Nero's circus, where the Vatican stands today. Paul, beheaded on the Via Ostiensis. Roman citizens were entitled to a more dignified death. Historians debate the details. The sources are late, sometimes contradictory. But what is clear is that less than a generation after Nero's tortures, Christianity had deep roots in Rome, deep enough to survive the decapitation of its leaders.
And Tacitus, Publius Cornelius Tacitus, was born around AD 56, 8 years before the Great Fire. He did not witness the events he would later describe. He was a child when Nero fell. He grew up under the Flavians. He built his career under Domitian, Nerva, Trajan. Around AD 112 to 113, now elderly and respected, Tacitus began writing his Annals. The work would cover Roman history from the death of Augustus in AD 14 to the death of Nero in AD 68. More than half a century of intrigues, assassinations, wars, and transformations. He wrote for a specific audience: Rome's senatorial elite, men like him, men who had survived Domitian's tyranny and now breathed under Trajan's more liberal rule. His purpose was not to entertain, it was to instruct, to preserve memory, to warn against the excesses of absolute power. And when he reached Nero's reign, when he reached the Great Fire, when he needed to explain who those Christians were, whom the emperor had used as scapegoats, Tacitus did what any good historian would do. He researched. Where did Tacitus get his information about Christus? This is one of the most debated questions about the passage. He does not cite sources. Ancient historians rarely did. But we can speculate based on what we know of his methods. Tacitus had access to the Senate's archives. He explicitly mentions consulting them elsewhere in the Annals. It is possible, though not provable, that official records of the execution of agitators in Judea existed in Rome. Tacitus knew Pliny the Younger, who governed Bithynia and personally interrogated Christians. The two were close friends and exchanged letters. Pliny could have shared information about the movement's beliefs and origins. Tacitus may have consulted historical works now lost, including the history of Pliny the Elder, which covered the Neronian period, and which Tacitus himself cites as a source in other passages. And there were the Christians themselves. By around AD 110 to 115, when Tacitus was writing, Christianity had existed for 80 years. Its basic claims were widely known. Any educated Roman knew that Christians worshipped a man executed in Judea under Tiberius. The question is, did Tacitus simply repeat what Christians said about themselves? Or did he verify it independently? The answer matters. If Tacitus merely echoed Christian propaganda, his passage has limited value as independent evidence. It would be like citing a company's press release as proof that the company is honest. But there are reasons to think Tacitus did more than that. First, his character. Tacitus was notoriously skeptical. He distrusted rumor. Elsewhere in the Annals, he explicitly distinguishes between what was said and what he considers factual. When he had doubts, he said so. In the passage about Christus, there are no qualifiers. No, they say, or it is reported. Tacitus states it categorically. Christus was executed by Pilate under Tiberius.
Period. Second, the details. If Tacitus were merely repeating what Christians said, why would he use Procurator, a technically imprecise title for Pilate's office? Christians, quoting their own Gospels, would say governor, the term used by Matthew and Luke. Procurator is Roman bureaucratic language. Third, the tone. Tacitus shows no knowledge of or interest in Christian beliefs beyond the minimum necessary. He does not mention resurrection, miracles, teachings. If his source were Christian propaganda, those elements would surely appear. The most likely conclusion is that Tacitus had access to some kind of official or semi-official information about the execution of Christus, perhaps provincial records, perhaps administrative reports, perhaps intermediary sources he deemed reliable. We cannot prove it, but we can infer it. Tacitus died around AD 120. His annals circulated among Rome's elite, were copied, preserved, admired for their relentless style. But over time, as the empire became Christian, the work fell into relative obscurity. Why? Ironically, for the same reason the Church Fathers did not cite it. The passage about Christians was embarrassing. Calling them a pernicious superstition did not fit the new Christian order. The Annals survived by a thread. Of what were probably 18 original books, only parts survived. Books 1 to 6, with gaps, and 11 to 16, also incomplete. Lost among other sections was the portion covering AD 29 to 31, exactly the period during which Jesus' crucifixion would have occurred. Coincidence? Deliberate destruction? Simple accident of manuscript transmission? No one knows. What we do know is that sometime in the 11th century, a monk at the monastery of Monte Cassino copied what remained of the Annals into a codex we now call the Second Medicean. Monte Cassino, the monastery founded by Saint Benedict in the 6th century, one of the great centers for preserving classical learning in the Middle Ages. Without those monks, Christians note well, Tacitus' words would have vanished forever. The manuscript passed through various hands over the centuries. Eventually it reached the Medici family in Florence. Today it is housed in the Biblioteca Medicea Laurentiana, where it can be examined by scholars. And it has been examined, with magnifying glasses, with ultraviolet light, with paleographical techniques developed over centuries. The change from Christianos to Christianos was detected, debated, interpreted in multiple ways, but the passage remains intact in its essence, the testimony of a Roman historian who despised Christians, yet recorded, perhaps against his will, one of the strongest evidences that the man they worshipped truly existed. And the debate continues. Skeptics like Richard Carrier argue that the sentence about Christus may be an interpolation. They point to the silence of the Church Fathers, the manuscript alteration, the lack of other references to Nero's persecution before the 4th century. The overwhelming majority of historians, including atheists and agnostics like Bart Ehrman, reject this position. They regard the passage as authentic, valuable, one of the best extra-biblical evidences for the historicity of Jesus. Who is right? History rarely offers absolute certainty. We work with probabilities, with inferences, with the accumulated weight of evidence, and the weight of evidence in this case leans strongly toward authenticity. A 2nd century Roman historian, with no reason to invent, no sympathy for Christian faith, recorded that the founder of this movement was executed in Judea by order of Pontius Pilate during the reign of Tiberius. That does not prove Jesus worked miracles. It does not prove he rose from the dead. It proves nothing supernatural. But it does prove, or at least strongly corroborates, that he existed. And for history, that is already a great deal.
2,000 years later, the question persists. Did Jesus exist? It sounds absurd at first. We are talking about the most influential man in human history, the pivot of the Western calendar, the founder of a religion with more than 2 billion followers, the figure who inspired cathedrals, crusades,
reforms, revolutions, and yet the question is asked. On the internet, in forums, in videos with millions of views, a theory has gained traction: mythicism. The idea that Jesus never existed as a historical person, that he was invented, an amalgam of pagan gods, solar myths, Jewish messianic expectations, a fiction that became faith. It is a seductive theory for some, radical, iconoclastic, the kind of idea that makes you feel like you have discovered something they do not want you to know. But is it true? The vast majority of historians, Christian, Jewish, atheist, agnostic, say no. Bart Ehrman, a professor at the University of North Carolina, is one of the most famous New Testament scholars in the world. He is agnostic. He has written entire books criticizing the reliability of the Gospels, questioning traditional Christian doctrines, arguing that the Bible is full of contradictions and errors, and on the historical existence of Jesus, he is categorical. He certainly existed. As virtually every competent scholar of antiquity, Christian or non-Christian, agrees. Ehrman went further. He wrote an entire book, Did Jesus Exist?, refuting mythicism. Not because he is a Christian, he is not, but because he considers the theory historically untenable. And Tacitus is one of his central pieces of evidence. Why does Tacitus matter so much? Because he is independent. The Gospels were written by Christians, for Christians. Paul was an apostle. Josephus, though Jewish, may have had his passages about Jesus altered by later Christian copyists. The famous Testimonium Flavianum is debated to this day. But Tacitus? Tacitus was a Roman senator. He despised Christians. He called their faith a pernicious superstition. He had no reason to invent or promote the existence of Jesus, and yet he recorded that Christus was executed by Pilate under Tiberius. If this were a Christian invention, it would be the most incompetent invention in history. A Christian forger inserting text into Tacitus would not write that Christianity was an evil originating in Judea. He would not call Christians hated for their abominations. Tacitus's hostility is, paradoxically, the greatest guarantee of its authenticity. The debate over the Medician manuscript illustrates how history works in practice. Yes, the only surviving copy of the passage dates to the 11th century. Yes, there is evidence of alteration in the word Christianos. Yes, no church father cited the passage in the early centuries. But that does not mean forgery. It means ancient history is complicated, that documents survive through winding paths, that scribes make mistakes and sometimes correct them, that absence of evidence is not always evidence of absence. The historian works with what exists, weighs probabilities, compares sources, looks for coherence, and when multiple independent sources, Tacitus, Josephus, Pliny, Suetonius, Paul, the Gospels, point in the same direction, the probability increases. Jesus existed. He was executed in Judea, under Pontius Pilate, during the reign of Tiberius. That is what history can affirm with a high degree of confidence. What history cannot affirm is another matter. Miracles? Resurrection? Divine sonship? Those are questions of faith, not historiography. The historical method has no tools to verify the supernatural. It cannot prove that Jesus walked on water, just as it cannot prove that Buddha attained enlightenment or that Muhammad received revelations from an angel. History can say, a man named Jesus existed and was crucified. Faith says, that man was the Son of God and rose from the dead. These are different kinds of claims. Confusing them is a misuse of both history and theology. And Tacitus, in that sense, is the perfect witness. He did not believe anything Christians preached. To him, resurrection would have been absurd superstition. The idea of worshipping a crucified criminal would have been repulsive, and yet he confirmed the basic historical fact. This man existed and was executed.
It is as if a hostile prosecutor, trying to convict a defendant, accidentally provides an alibi. The witness did not want to help, but he helped. Tacitus did not want to prove Jesus existed. He only wanted to explain who those Christians were whom Nero burned alive. And in doing so, he left posterity one of the most valuable pieces of evidence in ancient history.
Today, the second Medicean manuscript remains in Florence. Scholars still examine it. Debates still simmer in academic journals, conferences, online forums. Tacitus's passage, Annals 15.44, remains at the center of discussions about the historical Jesus. It is cited in Christian apologetics and in works by atheist skeptics. It is analyzed by Latinists, Roman historians, New Testament scholars. 22 words in Latin, written nearly 2,000 years ago by a man who despised the faith that ironically would make him famous. Publius Cornelius Tacitus never imagined he would be remembered for this passage. For him, it was a minor detail, a necessary explanation about an obscure sect. For us, it is a window into the past, a proof that, at some point in the 1st century, on the eastern fringes of the Roman Empire, a man called Christus lived, preached, and died. What he meant, and what he still means, is a question each person must answer for himself. But that he existed? Even his enemy confirmed it. Now I ask you, if even those who despised Christians confirmed the existence of Christ, why do so many today still insist that he never existed? Reflect, comment, share.